Eastern Airlines. How labor wars destroyed America's favorite airline. Picture this. It's 1978, and Eastern Airlines is America's most profitable airline, carrying more passengers than any other carrier in the United States. Their sleek silver jets with the distinctive hockey stick logo crisscross the nation, connecting major cities with clockwork precision. The airline that pioneered the shuttle service between New York, Washington, and Boston has become synonymous with reliable air travel. Passengers love Eastern so much that the company proudly advertises itself as the wings of man. But beneath this glossy exterior, a cancer is growing that will ultimately destroy one of aviation's greatest success stories. Within just 13 years, this aviation giant will be dead, killed not by competition or economic downturn, but by a war between its own management and workers so vicious that it literally tore the company apart from the inside. Eastern Airlines began its journey in 1926 as Pitcairn Aviation, founded by Harold Pitcairn in Philadelphia. The company initially focused on mail delivery contracts, flying small single-engine aircraft between New York and Atlanta. In 1930, the operation was sold to Clement Keyes, who renamed it Eastern Air Transport, and by 1938, it had become Eastern Airlines under the leadership of World War I flying ace Eddie Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker, who purchased the airline from General Motors for $3.5 million, transformed Eastern into a powerhouse of innovation and customer service. Under his leadership, Eastern became the first airline to use the Douglas DC-4 for passenger service and pioneered numerous safety and operational improvements that became industry standards. By the 1950s, Eastern had established itself as one of the Big Four airlines alongside American, United, and TWA. The company's route network stretched from the Northeast Corridor down through the Southeast and into the Caribbean, with Miami serving as a crucial hub for Latin American travel. Rickenbacker's Eastern was known for treating both employees and customers exceptionally well, creating a corporate culture that emphasized service and loyalty. The airline's workforce took pride in their company, and Eastern's on-time performance and customer satisfaction ratings consistently ranked among the industry's best. The seeds of Eastern's destruction were planted in 1959 when Eddie Rickenbacker retired and sold his controlling interest to Lawrence Rockefeller. The new ownership brought in Malcolm McIntyre as president, marking the beginning of a more corporate, less personal approach to running the airline. McIntyre was followed by a succession of executives who increasingly viewed labor costs as the primary obstacle to profitability. In 1963, Floyd Hall took over as president and began implementing cost-cutting measures that put him at odds with Eastern's powerful unions. The International Association of Machinists, led by the combative Charlie Bryan, represented Eastern's mechanics and ground workers, while the pilots were represented by the Airline Pilots Association and the flight attendants by the Transport Workers Union. These unions had negotiated generous contracts during Eastern's profitable years under Rickenbacker, including industry-leading wages, benefits, and work rules. Hall and his successors viewed these contracts as unsustainable in an increasingly competitive airline industry, setting up a confrontation that would simmer for decades. The airline industry was changing rapidly, with new competitors entering the market and fare wars becoming common, but Eastern's management and labor seemed incapable of adapting together to these new realities. The 1970s brought both triumph and trouble for Eastern Airlines. On the positive side, the company continued to innovate and expand. Eastern introduced the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar to its fleet, becoming the launch customer for this advanced wide-body aircraft in 1972. The airline's shuttle service, launched in 1961, had become wildly successful, offering guaranteed seats with no reservations required between New York, Washington, and Boston every hour on the hour. Eastern was also a pioneer in computerized reservation systems, developing one of the industry's first automated booking systems in partnership with IBM. The airline's route network had expanded to include 142 cities, making it the largest airline in the United States by number of passengers carried. However, these achievements were overshadowed by escalating labor tensions and financial pressures. The 1973 oil crisis sent fuel costs soaring, while airline deregulation in 1978 opened Eastern's lucrative routes to new competition from low-cost carriers. Frank Borman, the former Apollo astronaut who became Eastern's president in 1975 and CEO in 1976, inherited a company that was profitable but increasingly squeezed between rising costs and competitive pressures. Despite Eastern posting record profits of $69 million in 1978, Borman was already warning that the airline's high labor costs would prove unsustainable in the deregulated environment. Frank Borman's leadership marked the beginning of Eastern's death spiral, though he entered the job with the best of intentions and strong credentials. As a former NASA astronaut and test pilot, Borman brought a military discipline and analytical mindset to Eastern's operations. He immediately identified labor costs as the airline's primary weakness, noting that Eastern's employees were among the highest paid in the industry while productivity lagged behind competitors. Borman's attempts to negotiate cost reductions with the unions met fierce resistance, particularly from Charlie Bryan and the Machinists' Union. Bryan, a shrewd and militant labor leader, viewed Borman's cost-cutting demands as an attack on workers' living standards and refused to make significant concessions. The relationship between Borman and Bryan became intensely personal and hostile, with Bryan publicly calling Borman a space cadet who didn't understand the airline business. Meanwhile, Borman grew increasingly frustrated with what he saw as union intransigence in the face of genuine competitive threats. The two men's mutual antipathy infected the entire organization, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and conflict that made rational negotiation nearly impossible. By 1980, Eastern was losing money despite carrying more passengers than any other U.S. airline, a situation that Borman blamed entirely on excessive labor costs and restrictive work rules. The early 1980s brought a series of devastating strikes and labor conflicts that severely damaged Eastern's reputation and financial position. In 1980, the Machinists' Union struck for 58 days, costing Eastern an estimated $125 million in lost revenue. The strike was bitter and divisive, with replacement workers crossing picket lines while union members engaged in sabotage and intimidation. Eastern's competitors capitalized on the disruption, stealing away business customers who couldn't afford the uncertainty of Eastern's unreliable service. When the strike finally ended, both sides were exhausted and resentful, but no fundamental issues had been resolved. Borman had failed to achieve the cost reductions he demanded, while the union felt betrayed by the company's willingness to operate with replacement workers. The pattern repeated itself throughout the early 1980s, with smaller work stoppages and slowdowns regularly disrupting Eastern's operations. In 1983, facing potential bankruptcy, Borman finally succeeded in negotiating wage cuts with all three major unions. But the concessions came with a price. The unions demanded representation on Eastern's board of directors and a stake in any future recovery. Charlie Bryan was appointed to Eastern's board, creating the surreal situation of having the company's chief antagonist sitting in its boardroom. The wage cuts temporarily improved Eastern's finances, but the underlying mistrust and hostility between management and labor remained as strong as ever. Desperate to save the airline, Eastern's board made a fateful decision in 1986. They sold the company to Frank Lorenzo, one of the most controversial figures in airline history. Lorenzo had built a reputation as a union buster through his ownership of Continental Airlines, where he had used bankruptcy proceedings to void labor contracts and drastically reduce wages. His Texas Air Corporation purchased Eastern for $676 million, promising to return the airline to profitability through aggressive cost-cutting and operational improvements. Lorenzo's arrival at Eastern was like pouring gasoline on a smoldering fire. The unions, already suspicious of any management initiative, viewed Lorenzo as an existential threat to their members' livelihoods. Charlie Bryan led the resistance, mobilizing not just Eastern's unions, but organized labor nationwide to oppose Lorenzo's plans. Lorenzo, for his part, made no secret of his intention to bring Eastern's labor costs in line with Continental's, which were roughly half of Eastern's levels. He began by demanding immediate wage cuts of up to 40% and the elimination of numerous work rules that he claimed made Eastern uncompetitive. When negotiations predictably stalled, Lorenzo began transferring Eastern's most profitable routes and newest aircraft to Continental, essentially using Eastern's assets to subsidize his other airline. This asset stripping enraged the unions and Eastern's employees, who saw their company being dismantled piece by piece to benefit Lorenzo's other business interests. The final death blow came in March 1989, when the Machinists' Union, backed by the pilots and flight attendants, launched what they called a strike to save Eastern Airlines. The irony was deliberate. The unions argued that only by stopping Lorenzo could Eastern be preserved as a viable company. The strike was total and devastating, with 8,500 machinists walking off the job and being joined by most pilots and flight attendants in sympathy. Eastern's operations ground to a virtual halt, with the airline canceling over 90% of its flights. Lorenzo tried to continue operations with replacement workers and managers pressed into service as mechanics and baggage handlers, but the effort was chaotic and ultimately futile. Eastern's reputation, built over 6 decades, was destroyed within weeks as passengers abandoned the airline en masse. The strike became a national cause célèbre for organized labor, with union members from other industries traveling to Eastern's hubs to join picket lines. Politicians, celebrities, and labor leaders rallied to support the striking workers, turning Eastern's plight into a symbol of the broader conflict between corporate America and working people. Meanwhile, Eastern was hemorrhaging cash at a rate of over $1 million per day, burning through its remaining assets with breathtaking speed. As the strike dragged on through 1989 and into 1990, Eastern entered bankruptcy proceedings while continuing to operate a skeleton schedule. Lorenzo's efforts to restart the airline were hampered by ongoing sabotage, regulatory challenges, and the simple fact that most travelers had written off Eastern as unreliable. The few flights that did operate were often delayed or canceled due to mechanical problems, staffing shortages, or security concerns. Eastern's fleet, once one of the youngest and most modern in the industry, began showing signs of poor maintenance as inexperienced replacement workers struggled to keep the aircraft airworthy. Federal safety inspectors increased their scrutiny of Eastern's operations, finding numerous violations that further damaged the airline's credibility. By late 1990, Eastern was operating fewer than 30 flights per day compared to over 1,000 flights daily before the strike. The airline's workforce had shrunk from 37,000 employees to fewer than 5,000, most of whom were replacement workers or management personnel. Eastern's hubs in Miami, Atlanta, and New York resembled ghost towns, with empty gates and idle aircraft serving as monuments to the destructive power of unresolved conflict. The final humiliation came when Eastern was forced to sell its prized shuttle operation to Donald Trump for $365 million, stripping away the service that had been the airline's crown jewel and primary source of profitability. On January 18, 1991, Eastern Airlines flew its final flight, a Boeing 727 from Miami to Atlanta, carrying just 12 passengers. The end came not with celebration or ceremony, but with a quiet whimper as the last remnants of America's once favorite airline simply ceased to exist. The bankruptcy court had finally run out of patience with Eastern's inability to return to profitability, and the airline's remaining assets were liquidated to pay creditors. In its final years, Eastern had lost over $2.5 billion, making it one of the most expensive corporate failures in American history at that time. The human cost was equally staggering. 37,000 employees lost their jobs, many of whom never found comparable employment in the airline industry. Entire communities that had grown up around Eastern's operations in Miami, Atlanta, and elsewhere were devastated by the airline's collapse. The shutdown also eliminated crucial air service to smaller cities throughout the Southeast and Caribbean, some of which never regained the same level of connectivity. Charlie Bryan, the militant union leader who had fought so hard to save his members' jobs, had ultimately presided over the destruction of every job he sought to protect. Frank Lorenzo, the corporate raider who promised to restore Eastern to profitability, had instead engineered one of the most spectacular business failures of the 20th century. The destruction of Eastern Airlines stands as one of business history's most tragic examples of how internal warfare can destroy even the strongest companies. Eastern had everything needed for success: a valuable route network, loyal customers, modern equipment, and skilled employees. What it lacked was the ability of management and labor to work together toward common goals. The airline's death was not inevitable. Other carriers facing similar challenges in the deregulated environment found ways to adapt and survive. Eastern's failure was ultimately a failure of leadership on both sides, with management and labor leaders so focused on defeating each other that they lost sight of their shared interest in the company's survival. The lessons from Eastern's collapse reverberated throughout the airline industry and beyond, demonstrating that in business, as in war, sometimes everyone loses. Today, Eastern's former hubs are dominated by other airlines, its routes are flown by competitors, and its employees have scattered to other careers. The company that once carried the slogan, "We have to earn our wings every day," serves as a permanent reminder that in the unforgiving world of commercial aviation, yesterday's success means nothing if you can't adapt to tomorrow's challenges.